Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this is our second bonus episode in which we take a break from Christie's novels. Today, we'll be discussing Christie's second published short story, The Tragedy at Marsdon Manor, which was first published on April 13th, 1923 in The Sketch magazine. Diving right in, let's start with the murder victim of this story.
Our victim is Mr. Maltravers of Marsdon Manor. He was found on his estate as he was out shooting rooks with his rook rifle by his side.
As one does.
Yeah, as one does, and blood on his lips. He recently took out a life insurance policy for £50,000, which is actually the same amount of money as in The Adventure of the Western Star, which is a huge amount of money.
I feel like Christie she just has like £50,000, i.e. a lot of money. She just sort of like used that as her catch-all for a lot of money in 1923.
Definitely seems that way. So we're talking about, £500,000 probably, give or take, in today's money. And he was judged to be in good health at the time, but he died mere months later. So obviously the insurance company thought that's pretty suspicious. And that maybe he killed himself so that his wife could collect the policy because it seemed like he was maybe about to go bankrupt. And Poirot is a friend of the director of the insurance company, and a favor was called in, and he has been asked to investigate. So he and Hastings take a train to Marsden Lee.
Okay, so let's go through the suspects because it is not going to take very long. There are not many suspects in this story, which is a little bit of a problem.
Well, we should also probably point out that it's about 10 pages long.
Yes, that's true. This is a very short story. The first short story we did was, I think, 28 pages. This one is, I don't know, 12, 13 pages, something like that. So it's less than half. The first and main suspect is Mrs. Maltravers, who's the young and beautiful wife of Mr. Maltravers. They have been married for just a little over a year. And when Poirot and Hastings first meet her, they are struck both by her beauty, especially Hastings, of course, and also by how distraught she seems at her husband's death. She can barely hold it together.
Right. And so then we get Dr. Bernard, who is the country doctor. He is the one who examined the dead man, and he's convinced that the death was some kind of ulcer, like an internal hemorrhage of some kind, and that accounts for the blood on the dead man's lips.
Which I would just like to point out that the internal hemorrhage they're talking about that creates blood on the lips, many listeners may actually be familiar with this effect if they watched the final season of Downton Abbey, when Lord Grantham, spoiler alert if you're still making your way through Downton Abbey, although who are you? Who are you if you're still making your way through Downton Abbey and listening to this podcast? I suspect you probably already watched it or just gave up seasons earlier.
Yeah, that would be me.
As many people I know did. Did you give up on it? Yeah. But in the final season of Downton Abbey, there's this kind of spectacular scene where Lord Grantham, in their beautiful dining room, shoots up from the table and just vomits blood everywhere, and everyone just kind of freaks out, and that's what happened to him. He had an ulcer that just exploded inside of him.
Gee, I'm not at all regretting that I did not watch that. Okay, and so then the only other suspect that we're talking about. is Captain Black, who's a distant family friend.
Mm-hmm.
He is noted by Hastings as being not ill-looking, which is an interesting way to describe a person.
My theory on that is that Hastings, of course, will go into raptures about almost any woman that he comes across, but doesn't really care about what other men look like. So to even note the fact that he is not ill-looking means that Captain Black must be pretty darn handsome.
And he's very devoted to Mrs. Maltravers. And on top of it, he dined with the couple the night before Mr. Maltravers died. So that's it. Those are our only suspects.
So let's get to the world as it seems to be before we actually solve this mystery. Poirot manages to ascertain that what killed Mr. Maltravers was not an ulcer attack. It was actually a bullet to the brain from the rook rifle that's lying beside Mr. Maltravers' body. And a rook rifle is, it's a small rifle that shoots small bullets, which is why the bullet, if the rifle was lodged into the man's mouth and shot upward, it would actually get lodged in his brain and not shoot out the other side, which is why it's not obvious that this is what happened. Although I would argue that Dr. Bernard is a pretty bad doctor, since I guess he didn't, open the corpse's mouth. So the conclusion drawn from that is that Mr. Maltravers killed himself so that his wife could collect the massive insurance policy that he just took out and thereby avoid the financial ruin that was coming upon him. And Poirot apologetically tells her, I'm going to have to go tell the insurance company who sent me out here about this, and that means that you're not going to be able to collect on the policy. Maybe the dishy Captain Black, who it's hinted has feelings for her, will be able to comfort her. We're not sure, but that's kind of the state of affairs before we actually get to figuring out what really happened here.
We have one suspect.
We filled out the list of suspects just because we wanted to be able to list the characters even in the story. But to be fair, I feel like there's only one true suspect, which is Mrs. Maltravers. So the question is, was it suicide or did she murder her husband?
And she obviously murdered her husband. In very cold blood, I would say, too.
Very, very cold blood. This is actually a really, really dark one. But so the first clue that we come across might be my favorite because it is pretty random in that it involves one's understanding of what it means to be a Christian Scientist. Basically, early in this story, Dr. Bernard makes this throwaway comment about Mr. Maltravers being a Christian Scientist, which is why he never examined him when he was alive. And the thing about Christian Scientists is that they have this belief that they can essentially pray away any illness, that illness is more a state of mind, and that being with God allows one to heal oneself. Whenever I think Christian Scientists, I always think of The Secret Garden, because it was written by Frances Hodgson Burnett, who herself is a Christian Scientist. And it's just a good concrete example of that philosophy, in that you have that bedridden boy in that story, Colin, who has spent years just thinking that he's sick. And then, through the magic of Mary and ultimately The Secret Garden, he decides that he's not sick, and he's not. And then he's not. So there are a ton of cases, sadly, of Christian Scientists not seeking medical attention because that's just not part of their philosophy, which is what Dr. Bernard means when he says, "Oh, I think he was a Christian Scientist." That's why I would never see him, because Christian Scientists just they don't fret over their health, and they certainly don't seek medical advice. But
the curious thing about this as a clue is that if Dr. Bernard had never seen Mr. Maltravers, how did Dr. Bernard then know that Mr. Maltravers was a Christian Scientist? Somebody had to have told him that, and given that there's only one possibility of who that was, it was Mrs. Maltravers.
And she even, when she's talking to Poirot and Hastings, she says that her husband did fret a lot about his health and was very worried about getting a second ulcer attack because he had a first ulcer attack. So she is basically singing a different tune to them than the tune she must have sung to Dr. Bernard. And so Poirot, very early on, his little gray cells are telling him that something is not quite matching.
Right. Okay. So our second clue then is that Mrs. Maltravers is quite upset to see that Captain Black is back in town. And so from that, we clearly have to realize that there must be something that happened at dinner, perhaps, that was off and that she does not want to not come to the surface since her husband has been murdered.
Right. So this is probably my least favorite clue in the story because it's so awkward. Realizing this, Poirot then decides to engage in a game of word association where he says different words to Captain Black and notes what the responses are. I'm actually just going to read it because it's so weird, and here we go. We will commence. This is Poirot. We will commence. Day. There was a moment's pause, and then Black replied, night. As Poirot proceeded, his answers came quicker. Name, said Poirot. Place. Bernard. Shaw. Tuesday. Dinner. Journey. Ship. Country. Uganda. Story. Lions. Rook rifle. Farm. Shot. Suicide. Elephant. Tusks. Money. Lawyers. That's it. By that point, I was like, what? What am I reading? What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, the Bernard Shaw one was especially weird.
Yeah.
And the rationale,
well, which I guess shows that he's not.
Is that Poirot says that he can't possibly have known about Dr. Bernard because his immediate answer when presented with Bernard was not doctor, but the playwright.
The whole thing's a little silly, but the key part of that wordplay is rook rifle, farm. Poirot says shot. Captain Black says suicide. And what they come to realize after further questioning of Captain Black is that at dinner the night before Mr. Maltravers died, Captain Black told them a story about a man who had committed suicide with a rook rifle in Africa, which is where Captain Black had been. And the man was found with blood on his lips, exactly as Mr. Maltravers had been found. Third clue, this is very tiny. We can just do this quickly. Mrs. Maltravers' eyes are extremely red. She makes a little bit too much out of her morning appearance. Hastings, of course, does not pick up on it, but Poirot suspects that she's putting rouge on her eyelids. And I just have to say that just imagining putting a powder on the around the rim of your eye just sounds really painful and unpleasant.
Funny story. I was in a fashion show in college. And the makeup artist...
that's how Kate Middleton met.
I know. Unfortunately, I did not get...
Fortunately, you did not meet a prince.
I did not get a giant sapphire ring out of it. I did, however, get a combination of lipstick and some kind of powder used as eyeliner. And it is not pleasant to have eyeliner that is some combination of lipstick and powder.
So you can speak from experience as to the unpleasantness.
I can definitely speak to the unpleasantness, yes.
So given those three clues, it's pretty clear that there are only two possibilities. Either Mr. Maltravers heard that story at dinner and then he killed himself, or Mrs. Maltravers heard it and she used the story deviously to kill her husband. And given those three clues in totality, Poirot comes to the conclusion that Mrs. Maltravers is the murderer. And we're at our final phase in our synopses of these stories, which is the reckoning. And this is quite a reckoning. It's got a lot of drama. Essentially, Poirot exploits this local town legend that says Marsdon Manor is haunted, and he hires a local actor to pretend to be the dead Mr. Maltravers at dinner using makeup and a flashlight and some phosphorescence on the tips of his fingers. And then he gets Inspector Japp to come down from Scotland Yard and tap intermittently at the window. Then Poirot pretends to lock a door that swings open to have Mrs. Maltravers watch terrified as the door swings open again, seeming to defy the laws of physics, revealing this actor as Mr. Maltravers. The lights go out, there's more banging. Poirot then grasps Mrs. Maltravers' hand, smearing it with red paint, then drawing her attention to it so that she assumes it's blood. And finally, after all of this, she confesses to having killed her husband. And what happened is that she heard the story, and then the next day, while they were out walking and her husband had the rook rifle, she must have referenced the story and said, how is that really possible? How could someone kill themselves with a rook rifle? The husband must have very helpfully demonstrated the rifle going into the roof of his mouth, at which point Mrs. Maltravers pulled the trigger and killed him.
Right, up close and personal.
Yeah, that's a pretty... And the story ends with that explanation, Poirot saying, and she pulled the trigger. And it's just very final and brutal. Just a couple of thematic notes. I was struck by the extreme skepticism of this story, especially pairing it to the first short story that we discussed, The Adventure of the Western Star. There was a rejection of the superstition in that story of all of the Chinese god business that was going on there. And we have the same thing here in that all of the haunting of Marsdon Manor and that whole sequence that Poirot concocts is very much false, but it's kind of like the superstition that Mrs. Marsden harbors is what brings her down. Her lack of skepticism is what her ultimate downfall is. And you could argue that it's not quite credible that someone who is as calculating and cold-blooded and devious as she would believe in ghosts.
What are you saying that all those ghost hunters shows aren't real?
It's just like she's taking skepticism even a step further. I think Agatha Christie seems to punish those who don't necessarily share it. To perhaps inject even more skepticism into this story, I was thinking about it, and I went to law school. I suspect that if Mrs. Marsden employs even just a decent lawyer, that the confession that Poirot was able to get out of her, even though it was witnessed by multiple people, could probably be thrown out in a court.
Well, even weirder, the fact that Inspector Japp is down there, like, tapping underneath the windows. We don't actually... I mean, like, what was Scotland Yard doing in this?
You could almost argue it's not really entrapment, but it's edging into that territory.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's a setup for sure. So, yeah. I don't think, at least Poirot here was not thinking forward to the potential trial, I guess.
Right. Which is he's usually more forward thinking than that. The other thing that struck me was the contrast between the short stories and the novels that we've discussed thus far, because I think that in The Mysterious Affair at Styles and The Secret Adversary, The Murder on the Links, Christie is creating a happier world at the end of her story than seems to exist in the middle of it. And that's mainly through the happy conclusion of romantic subplots. It's actually, I can even be more specific than that. It's through ending with two happy couples in all three of those books. All three of those books, and end with two couples who had not been together over the course of the book and seems like they might never be together, being together at the end of the book. And there's a certain satisfaction and contentment that ends those novels.
All's well that ends well.
All's well that ends well. That is entirely missing in these short stories, and is much more stark in this one than the Western Star. But in the Western Star, Mary Marvell is minus a diamond, and the woman who seemed like such an upstanding British wife had actually at least been indiscreet with an American actor, and people are not exactly as they seem to be, and that doesn't get resolved. That's kind of a fact of life. And here it's even worse. This young wife who seemed so distraught over her husband turns out to be just awful and doesn't care at all about the dashing Captain Black, who may or may not actually be in love with her. He's just left in the lurch at the end, and the world is a colder place. And I think that that's something that Christie will be exploring a whole lot more of, not only in the short stories, but in the novels. I think they get a little bit more stark, and we don't have that sense of a happy ending or the world as it really is necessarily being better or warmer or brighter than it seems to be in that more confusing book.
Yeah, or perhaps even that it's worse. That the only consolation is that at least it can be solved.
Exactly. Yeah, at least the murderer can be known.
Right. And get caught, you know? I mean, that like loose ends tied up. But that's basically the only consolation that you get for these sort of terrible acts happening.
So should we talk about the adaptation?
Yes. It obviously had to be fleshed out a little bit, I'd say.
I think that this one really benefits from having to be fleshed out, because I at least think that they only made it better.
Oh, definitely. So just to be clear, it was the 6th episode of the 3rd season, and it aired February 3rd, 1991.
Let's just start and go through really quickly the mystery puzzle complications that were added to the story, because I thought they were really clever. Right. The best one is that instead of this word association game, that's completely thrown out. And Captain Black comes to the Maltraverses at Marsdon Manor with a gift for Mrs. Maltravers. And it's an African statue that he's wrapped in newspaper from Kenya or Kenya.
Yes, he does call it. Interestingly.
There's a newspaper from Kenya wrapped around the statue, just as wrapping paper. And, of course, it's the wrapping paper that is the key here, not the statue itself. There's a headline in that newspaper about a farmer killing himself with a rook rifle. And Mrs. Maltravers sees that headline, and that's what gives her the idea. And it's just such a better, more clever, more interesting clue than the word association that happens in the original.
Right, although it is the obvious tell to the audience very early on.
Sort of. I would argue the opposite. I think we both watched this right after having read the short story, so it was obvious to me. I saw the words of the headline right away. I kind of feel like if I hadn't read the short story, though, I don't know if the camera even lingers that long on the newspaper. I guess it does. It lingers long enough to be able to read the headline.
Yeah, it definitely does.
I'm not sure it's super obvious.
Well, attention is drawn to it because of the headline's placement on the parcel also.
Sure.
So,
yeah. But they had to do that. I mean, that's only fair. You have to give the viewer a decent chance to actually read that headline.
Right. Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And also, there's a red herring in it, which is not in the story, because it's containing what seems to be like some kind of talisman, right? An African statue that plays into the sort of superstitious nature of the surroundings, which are incredibly amped up in the adaptation.
Incredibly amped up, which is, adds to the atmosphere and just makes it more interesting. In the short story, it's mentioned halfway through that there's a local myth about the house being haunted, but that's it. Here, we open up on voices, and Mrs. Maltravers very much seems to be haunted by this girl who killed herself at the estate generations ago, and there's a whole lot of superstitious stuff. Another clue is that Mrs. Maltravers is made to be an amateur painter, and she claims to have been painting all morning before her husband's dead body was discovered. And when Poirot looks at the painting later, he says, this solves everything. And of course, Hastings has no idea what he's talking about, because Hastings never knows what Poirot is talking about until it's spoon-fed to him. And the shadows in the painting are all wrong. If Mrs. Marsden had been actually painting in the morning, the shadows would have been flipped. So she, must have painted the painting at another time, and then she had it ready so that she could use that as her alibi. So that's a clue that's just added. Not
like she couldn't have like some artistic freedom with her work.
She didn't look like the kind of painter that was being super expressive or abstract or going outside the bounds of traditional painting.
No, so I suppose that's the case. So we should also talk about Mr. Maltravers' secretary, who has like a very severe look. The wife has a 1930s kind of like curled blonde hair, sad eyes, delicate look, and of course the secretary is rigid. And it seemed like perhaps she was in love with Mr. Maltravers. Yeah. And certainly
she had a little bit of a Jane Eyre mixed with Miss Hannigan.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And it had that distinct vibe to it. And also it's clear that she's like resentful towards Mrs. Maltravers.
And again, there were no suspects in the original short story, so they had to add a character like that. It was necessary.
Right, and Captain Black is also a more convincing possible suspect.
Yeah, he's around more. He's more in the story. The last clue that they added is that rather than have the rook rifle just be lying next to the dead body, it's not. And what happened is that Mrs. Maltravers concealed the rook rifle in some bushes, and when she did, she disturbed a robin's nest, which is why when they are searching around the dead man's body, they find these eggs on the ground, and one of them breaks open, and Poirot just uses that to help deduce what exactly happened.
Right. And then the other big addition, I would say, is that the actual mechanism to get Poirot and Hastings involved is completely different. And it's
so much better.
Well, I mean, it's way more charming, although it seems implausible somehow. Basically, a very overeager amateur novelist had mailed a letter to Poirot because really he needed Poirot's help finishing his mystery book. But Poirot, for some unclear reason, misreads the letter and thinks he's actually being brought in on a real case.
Well, I think that the innkeeper, the aspiring novelist innkeeper, it sounds like I don't know if his letter was purposely as misleading as it turned out to be, but it read as this very real and intriguing case, and it, of course, was just an entirely fictional case. And we get a close-up on the manuscript itself, and we see that he's chosen a pseudonym of Clarissa Naughton, which I think that Clarissa is a clever little nod to Agatha. It's more clever than calling him Agatha Naughton. Clarissa was one of Agatha Christie's middle names. It was the name of her mother. So it's just a name that's somewhat associated with her for people who know their Christie trivia. I appreciated that. And it actually made me think of something that Christie talked about in her autobiography. Yep, I am shoehorning an autobiography passage into this discussion because that is what I do. I just thought this was interesting that Christie actually wanted to use a pseudonym herself, and here's what she wrote about that. I had wanted to write my books under a fancy name, Martin West or Mostyn Gray, but John Lane, that's her UK publisher, had been insistent on keeping my own name, Agatha Christie, particularly the Christian name. He said, Agatha is an unusual name which remains in people's memories, so I had to abandon Martin West and label myself henceforth as Agatha Christie. I had the idea that a woman's name would prejudice people against my work, especially in detective stories, that Martin West would be more manly and forthright. However, as I have said, when you are publishing a first book, you give way to whatever is suggested to you, and in this case, I think John Lane was right.
Oh, giving some mild credit to
John Lane at the Bodley Head, who we'll get to this in a book or two, but she would not be having such warm feelings about him
later, fairly
quickly. But obviously, the way that Poirot gets to Marsdon Manor is much more comedic than in the original story.
And also, I would point out that the reason he gets involved in the case is because of exactly the same plot mechanism that was used in Murder on the Links, which is that he was recognized on the street. Sure. I mean, I don't know, it's hard to imagine, especially in a pre-internet age, that he's that recognizable in just random towns in the English countryside, but I guess he is.
Well, if that random town in English countryside has a waxworks museum that features a waxwork of Hercule Poirot himself, perhaps he would be recognized.
Well, that is also, as you say, very convenient that this small English town has a wax museum, and that Monsieur Poirot has his own wax figure.
Yeah, there's a bit of hijinks that go on with the wax figure. I love this moment at the end of the adaptation when they're back in the wax museum. Poirot is so excited for Hastings and Japp to see his waxwork figure, and they very meanly pretend. They don't really pretend not to see it, but they refuse to comment on it, and Poirot leaves in a huff, and then Hastings puts the tie askew, and Japp tilts the hat, and they leave, and it's an adorable moment.
Well, I suppose we'd better be leaving. Catch our train.
Oh, no, Chief Inspector. It is still early. And the exhibits here are quite remarkable, n'est-ce pas? To be immortalized in such a fashion unique. Ah, quel honneur. Oh, I wonder what is around here.
Oh, very impressive.
Quite incredible.
It's a masterpiece.
True work of art.
That's his curly hair to a T.
Even got the little dimples on his cheeks, look.
A real piece of craftsmanship, wouldn't you say?
The whole tone is a little more antic-filled than I think the actual short story is.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, I also love David Suchet has this brilliantly funny look of just abject, white-hot rage on his face when he finds out that the innkeeper has, we can't clip it because it's all visual. There's no audio. But when he finds out that the innkeeper is talking about a novel and not an actual case, he's just so angry. And then in the next scene, also one of my favorite parts, he calls it a wild gooseberry hunt.
Yes.
Which is what he means for a wild goose chase. Sometimes the Poirot, he's not that good at English jokes are not that great, but I thought a wild gooseberry hunt was
No, it was charming. And I think the other thing, the small detail that I really loved later on, and it's literally like one line, but he actually does figure out a solution to the innkeeper's mystery.
Yes, and it involves a poison dart
thrown out a window
into a fruitcake.
Yeah,
I think it's a poison dart through a window into a fruitcake, but there are definitely poison darts that feature in solutions to Christie mystery puzzles.
No, but I mean, there's just a small detail that even though he's so incredibly enraged that this is what brought him to the inn, he can't help himself. He has to figure out a solution.
Yeah,
it's mystery solving OCD.
There's also a funny moment when they go to visit the doctor.
Is it an emergency? The doctor does have rather a lot of house calls later this morning.
S'il vous plaît, madame, say to him it is Hercule Poirot.
Thank you, doctor.
I think that he will see me.
Goodbye. Doctor, there's a gentleman outside suffering from Hercule Poirot. He seems to think it's quite serious.
There's just a lot of really, really bad yet adorable jokes going on in this. And I think it's just when you have such a basic story that you can fill out so much, the producers and the writer and the director of this series just ran with it. And I'm realizing now, reading these stories and watching them back to back, that's like such a key part of why this series is as good as it was. Obviously, it has the bones of these amazing mysteries, but the additions and the tweaks that they do as to tone are brilliant and crucial.
Right, and it helps, we've said this before, but having touchstone characters. I mean, Hastings and Jap are clearly in the short story. Jap, barely, but
I don't think Jap is mentioned, but I don't think he even appears on the page. We know he was at the window tapping.
No, he doesn't. But he's incorporated into the television episode much earlier.
Right. And just the period flair that they add to there's a scene involving a civil defense meeting. This is set in the mid-30s. It's ramping up to World War II, and all the people in the town go into what seems to be the town hall, and they're learning how to use gas masks. Mm-hmm. And it's actually even used to add to the intrigue because Mrs. Maltravers pretends that someone tried to chloroform her gas mask when she's actually the one that chloroformed herself.
Right.
But just that period detail that was a weird time. There were these civil defense meetings where people were learning how to use gas masks and just sort of.
It actually is it's an eerie shot too when they first enter the auditorium.
It's really because those old-fashioned gas masks are super eerie. They're very alien looking.
Right.
No, I agree. The whole episode with all of the superstitious, haunting kind of ghost stuff that's happening is even with all the lightness, it certainly has its creepy moments too. It's kind of firing on all cylinders.
Right.
I loved this episode, if you can't tell.
I can tell. I enjoyed it very much. And I just think mostly because the mystery is not all that intriguing, right? But the actual atmospherics are great. And also, this is just a random aside because I'm a real estate nerd, but I was obsessed with the house.
Oh yeah, the house is gorgeous.
The house is like this Georgian, country manor that has like the room that she paints in is fabulous, like a solarium.
I actually know what it's called.
Oh,
this is because it's Seno Hall.
Okay,
which is a large house and estate located in North Norfolk, England. And it's a Georgian house built in. I would not have known that was a Georgian house. Good for you,
nerd.
A Georgian house built in 1774 for Edmund Woodhouse, MP. So there
There you go. Yeah, I was, I think one of the great things about this show, I mean, all the period details, obviously, but their location choices are pretty much consistently top tier. Like, that is some A-game.
It's a showcase for, it's a showcase for the beauty of England.
Yeah, and it's
just amazing.
It's also nice, to have like a variety because, some of the, deco buildings are obviously all great. Sure. But, this was like a lovely little surprise that I was really excited to, sort of voyeuristically look at. So that was this week's bonus episode. Thank you so much for listening, and please check out our Twitter account at All About the Dame.
You can also contact us via email. We would love to hear from you at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And please take a moment to rate and review us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts. It would mean a lot to us and really help us reach more people.
And we love feedback. So join us again next week when we read The Man in the Brown Suit.
Can't wait.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Everyone knows therapy is great for solving problems, but getting therapy has its own problems too, like finding the right therapist, fitting into their schedule, and of course, the cost. Well, BetterHelp can solve those problems. It's totally online and built around your schedule. It's surprisingly affordable too. Connect with a credentialed therapist by phone, video, or online chat, all from the comfort of your home. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P.